Good afternoon. Virtually everyone who approaches the study of American history, whether in school, university, whether in the US or abroad, they already know that Americans are different. Americans have their own sports, they have a quirky political culture and unique political institutions, a distinctive approach to criminal justice, an attachment to religion that stands out among Western nations, and a materialist and consumerist ethos that, again, is distinctive, and a pop culture that's easily identified or identifiable as American, from rock and roll and jazz and hip hop and soul, country music, to Hollywood blockbusters, the classic Western, comic books, daytime soaps, talk radio. So it's no surprise that perhaps the most dominant theme that students learn in classes on early American history is the formation of the American identity. Okay? How and when did American society become distinctively American, featuring uniquely American manners, philosophical and political sensibilities, the distinctive religiosity and sociology and the pop culture, etc. Now, Americans and non-Americans have been interested in this issue ever since 1776, and it was always tied to the question of why they fought for independence against the British. Okay, so it's a very old debate. In 1776, when Tom Paine explained to American readers why they should rebel in his famous Common Sense pamphlet, he argued that over the course of the colonial era, English colonists had undergone a transformation, okay? A long and persistent, gradual process of Americanization. Okay? So Paine's pamphlet was, in part at least, a history of colonial America in which the general theme was that the colonists had gradually become less British and more American in their culture and ideals and values. Now, according to Paine, Americans gradually drifted away from English influence, forming their own cultural traits and new ideas about government and citizenship. Thus, the Revolution of 1776 simply gave political form after the fact to the real revolution that had taken place in the hearts and minds of Americans over the previous century and a half during the colonial era. And the result of this gradual Americanization was what was produced in 1776, and that is a new nation state, a new form of government, and a new philosophy of government, as articulated in the 1787 Constitution. Okay? So this is what Tom Paine said in real time, and what respected historians like Gordon Wood, for example, say today, 250 years after the fact. The other side of the debate are scholars, myself included, who see the settlers as conventional Englishmen. They do not see them as having been transformed or Americanized into something else. These historians channel the colonists themselves, who did not talk about themselves as Americanized during the colonial era. So these historians argue that settlers retained their English identity, their English patriotism, English customs and sensibilities. And rather than being a new civilization, the Americans were British they remained British, and they rebelled because they were British, not because they'd become something different. Okay? So these historians, the uniquely American identity that we all know took form after the revolution. The American traits that we identify as uniquely American developed mostly after 1776 in the context of a war against Britain, and then in the context of an independent country with its own distinct path in the world and internal dynamics. So the debate about Americanization and about Americanization and the American Revolution is whether American independence was a product of slow, gradual Americanization, or a product of the colonists' English identity and culture. Okay, so we're talking, was the American Revolution a product of Americanization or Anglicization? A product of the fact that Americans had become different, or the fact that Americans remained very much English? Okay. Now, of these two narratives, these two interpretations of the revolution, the narrative of Americanization as the driver of the American Revolution is the dominant one. Okay? If you survey early American historians or non-historians, or even children who haven't yet taken a U.S. history class, that's the story they'll tell you about the American Revolution. Okay? First of all of us, from scholars to elementary school students in America and abroad, are introduced to colonial and revolutionary America preloaded with the knowledge that the United States is today a distinctive and also idiosyncratic country, and one with a unique role in the world. It's a technological and cultural and economic and military superpower. Okay? So we're therefore, we're all encouraged by the world that we live in, by the knowledge that the United States is this kind of unique country. It encourages us to identify colonial antecedents to this distinctive path that the United States would take as an independent nation after 1776. Moreover, it also makes intuitive sense, anthropologically speaking, that the American environment, that North America would reshape the culture of European settlers. After all, we expect people living in different environments, hot versus cold, mountains versus, mountainous terrain versus flat terrain, arid versus fertile. We expect peoples living in different environments to differ from one another culturally. And we know that the environment of a given society shapes its culture. Okay? Now, I'm sure that most of you remember from your school days the famous letters from an American farmer. It's a 1782 publication by a French settler in New York, upstate New York, called Michel de Crèvecoeur. And in these letters, in this pamphlet or book that he published, he explained to European readers what Americans are like. And Crèvecoeur explained to his audience that Americans are Europeans who had been transformed by America itself. And here, let me read to you the section. Okay. Europeans submit insensibly to these great powers of environment that's my addition, but that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the effects of the environment, the subconscious effect of the environment on settlers. Okay? So Europeans submit insensibly to the great powers of environment and become, in the course of a few generations, not only Americans in general, but either Pennsylvanians, Virginians, or provincials under some other name. The inhabitants of Canada, Massachusetts, the middle provinces, and the southern provinces will be as different as their climates. So you can see here a clear explanation of the environmental effect on the culture of individual people. Another fellow that you'll recognize who tells the same story about the American environment shaping European settlers is a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. In explaining why Eastern Europe was the proper site for German settlement, for this living space that Germans needed to expand to, Hitler stressed that only in Eastern Europe and its cold climate can the German character persist unchanged. And so he wrote, transplant a German to Kiev, and he remains a perfect German. But transplant him to Miami, and you make a degenerate of him. In other words, an American. So, so you see this explanation about America Americanizing European settlers transmitted to audiences in America, in Europe, and beyond from early on. Okay, we see it in Tom Paine in 1776 and in Crèvecoeur in the 1780s to Gordon Wood today. Okay, and that funny quotation or entertaining quotation from Hitler shows that Hitler absorbed this historical interpretation growing up in Austria in the early 20th century, and all of us absorbed it. Okay, American kids absorb it through American culture and the American history classes or historical consciousness that they absorb, however they absorb things. I grew up in Israel. I absorbed the same thing, the same storyline about Americanization. And again, the effect of the American environment on the people who live in it. Now, historians and other observers have provided variants of this explanation for the development of American identity in the 19th and 20th centuries, examining not only the transformative, the Americanizing influence of America's geography, topography, climate, the flora and fauna, but also the transformative effects of America's social environment. Its racial diversity, its ethnic and religious diversity compared to England, its cheap land and high wages, which was always a feature of American life from colonial times to today. Slavery, okay, the fact that there were no slaves in England, plenty of slaves in America. That's environmental, a difference in terms of the social environment. The absence of a legal aristocracy in America. Okay? So these scholars argue that these unique features of America's social environment, just like the unique features of America's physical environment, shaped Americans' political sensibilities, religious sensibilities, their ethical and economic thinking, their racial sensibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And these scholars insist, what they have in common, all of them, the ones who focus on flora and fauna and weather and economics and racial diversity and everything else, what they have in common is that they all insist that the American character was molded in America and by America, okay, by America's natural and social environment. By the same token, historians of American speech patterns or the American language, in following the same paradigm or the same pattern of thought, they hold that American regional accents formed in America over time by mixing of English or Anglo settlers with other ethnicities in different parts of America. Okay? The mixing of Anglos and Africans and Scotch-Irish in the South, the mixing of Anglos and Dutch in New York and New Jersey, Anglos and Germans in the Middle Colonies, etc. And we all we all accept these storylines about Americanization because, like I said, they make a great deal of anthropological sense and common sense. And this is exactly why Americanization is tricky to deal with in public talks or in a book aimed at a general audience, because most people are not colonial historians, and so they don't realize that they hold this historiographical belief, this model about American history. Okay? They don't think that they are taking a position in a debate when they accept the narrative of Americanization. Okay? We all grew up within this framework of Americanization, no matter where and when we grew up. Okay? So we find ourselves espousing it without being aware that we are actually making a historiographical argument in favor of Americanization and against Anglicization. It's the same as how, as Democrats, we all promote democracy many times during the day without realizing it. Okay? For example, when you tell your son or daughter that he or she can't invite just the popular kids to a birthday party, okay? What you're doing is you're actually teaching your child a lesson about democracy, okay? But you're not aware that you're doing it. Okay? As you see it, you're just telling your kid a moral truth. Okay? Or if you're driving with your family and you want to stop for dinner, and you vote between McDonald's and Pizza Hut for tonight's dinner. Okay, you think that you're just deciding on burgers versus pizza, but in fact, you've just promoted democracy to your kids by promoting the idea of majority rule. Or when we follow certain protocols for how we advertise a job and how we interview candidates. When you grow up surrounded by democracy, that's all you know, and therefore you're not aware that you're espousing democracy many times a day. Okay? It's the same with Americanization. When I started my doctoral research on colonial warfare, I wasn't aware that I was promoting this historical framework of Americanization. I just thought I was telling what happened. Okay? But as I grew more familiar with the colonists' habits and beliefs, I became increasingly skeptical of the Americanization thesis. And as I continued my research from my first book to my second, to my third, I flipped to the other side, to the Anglicization camp. Because while there's no denying that environment does shape culture, we should also keep in mind that culture also shapes the environment. Okay? We see it all around us every day. as we pass agricultural fields, all fenced in and cleared of boulders and trees. We see it in the absence of wild animals in our towns. We see it in roads and drainage ditches. We see it in industrial pollution and mining operations. We see it in artificial lakes, diverted streams. I guess it's ubiquitous, okay? It's just that we probably do consider it. But the point is, environment shapes culture, culture shapes environment. If we relocated an agricultural tribe from the valley to the hills, those people will reshape the hills to create flat plots of land for agriculture on these hilltops. Okay? They'll dig irrigation canals to trap rainwater as it flows downhill. And I say this not theoretically, we've seen it in history. So, so the question is not which is true or false. Does environment shape culture, or does culture shape environment? Okay? Obviously, both happen all the time. The question is which force is more pervasive. Okay? In the American case, historians in my camp, in the Anglicization camp, argue that there's stronger evidence for English culture reshaping America than for America reshaping English culture. These historians point out that the English Empire transplanted to America not just people, but also their animals and their plants, and also a whole set of English practices, technologies, ideas, culture, material culture, and institutions. Okay? English crops drove out native vegetation. English livestock reshaped the forests into meadows and thus drove away native wildlife. English settlement and English civil engineering projects transformed the American landscape. Okay? So this side of the debate, of the Americanization debate, claims that colonial America was thus marked more by forces of Anglicization than Americanization. English settlers survived and thrived in America not because they were gradually transformed by Americanized, to fit into this new environment and take advantage of this new foreign environment. Rather, they prospered and multiplied here because they gradually Anglicized America to become less foreign, to become a place that would sustain their pre-existing English patterns of settlement and English agriculture and manufacturing and trade, social and civic organization. And these settlers transformed America through military conquest, settlement, farming, animal husbandry, logging, draining swamps, diverting rivers, fencing, and other forms of civil engineering. So as frontier communities grew, their frontier demographics and economics gave way to more conventional patterns of English social organization, meaning that as colonial settlements evolved from ragtag frontier communities to larger, safer, more prosperous conventional towns, these communities conformed more and more to English patterns of civic organization, family formation, religious practices, military practices, cultural habits. And so these towns became less uniquely American and more recognizably English. This allowed Anglo-American settlers to retain their English identity and customs and values and beliefs. So within this within this Anglicization framework, even the issue of American accents that I mentioned earlier gets a makeover. Okay? The opposing theory to the one I gave before, that it's America's social, unique social environment that produced American accents. The opposing theory to that is that American regional accents were transported ready-made to America from Britain. According to this view, Americans' regional accents simply indicate from which parts of the British Isles American settlers had originated. Okay, so this means that American regional accents are in fact regional British accents that were transported to America. That these regional British accents in Old England were washed away and intermingled into that these regional accents lost their regional distinctiveness because they're gradually mixed up together in England, but in America they were preserved because of the regional differentiation in this vast continent. And this debate holds for the French language as well, because some argue that North American conditions changed the speech patterns of French settlers in Canada to produce the quirky Quebec accent. Okay. Others claim that Quebecois French is a linguistic time capsule that preserved the sound of 17th century French. Okay, so what we have in North America today is a window to experience what French sounded like in France 300 years ago, 400 years ago. Whereas in France, the language evolved and softened and became just, it smoothed out more because of internal developments and internal migration and kind of a national French culture gradually kind of forming speech patterns throughout France. I'm not a linguist. I can't tell you where I stand on this debate. All I'm relating to you is that it's a real debate. Yeah? Is Canadian French a version of French that formed in North America, or was it carried to North America? Is it from France and just transported to North America? So when historians from the Anglicization camp, or in this case, with French, it'll be, what would be the term? Forget the terms then. When historians from the Anglicization camp consider family life, home furnishings, fashions, manners, religious practices, civic and political life, agriculture, manufacturing, commerce, etc., we do not see, again, historians from my camp, we don't see the colonies drifting away, farther and farther away from Britain's sphere of cultural influence. To the contrary, the empire encompassed a truly transatlantic civilization. English settlers in America did not display a growing sense of alienation or differentiation or distance from England during the 17th and 18th century. They referred to themselves as English or British. They saw Britain's accomplishments on the world stage as their own. They took pride in being active members of the British Empire. And they saw themselves as integral components of a British civilization. Okay. There's when I came to Texas years ago, I came across this quip that Texans use to explain Texas to outsiders. And what we say is that Texas is just like America, only more so. Okay? That Texas is not different from America, it's just an exaggerated version of America. Okay? And I paraphrase this quip in my book on the American Revolution to describe the American colonies in the 18th century. And that is that colonial America was just like England, only more so. Okay? Life in America did not create a different or new political ideology in American settlers' minds. Okay? Instead, life in America confirmed and strengthened English political beliefs into entrenched convictions. Okay? So even when the settlers resisted British imperial policies on the eve of the American Revolution, they understood their resistance as conventionally English. They understood themselves not as agents of change, not as agents of American ideas or American identity, but as defenders of traditional English values and liberties and practices. And they were right in the sense that the settlers' beliefs regarding self-government and arbitrary power and law, what the law said, their beliefs about law enforcement and criminal justice, these beliefs were mainstream beliefs in Old England, just as they were in the colonies. Their positions were not controversial in England. In fact, they had wide support in England. So the point is that the settlers understood their political resistance to Parliament as a product of their English inheritance, not a product of uniquely American sensibilities that they had acquired by living in America. These American ideas were as English as steak and kidney pie. As the colonists understood it, they resisted and eventually rebelled because they were English, not because they had taken on a new identity or political creed. Their complaints about arbitrary power and self-government simply reprised those 4 British rebellions in the previous century and a half, in the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, and the 2 Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745. Those previous British rebellions were trying to preserve the old established order against a king that was trying to change it. Okay? The same was true of British settlers in America. Okay? The Anglo-American rebels of 1776, just like the British rebels in those British rebellions that I just listed for you, were trying to preserve the old established order against an English parliament that was trying to change the imperial system. Okay, so the rebels of 1776 were not aiming to create a new order or system of government. Only during the war, during and after the war, did Americans develop their own separate national identity, which included a new system of government. Okay, but that was a development that took form during and after the war. It did not lead into the war. So over the past 25 years or so, the debate on Americanization has been the running theme of my career in both my scholarship and my classrooms. This is because we colonial historians are imperial historians. And imperial historians are interested in what happens in settler societies in which settlers travel from their home country to a new physical and social environment that is obviously different from the home environment. So So imperial and colonial historians examine what happens to English culture, or French or Dutch or German culture, Spanish culture, in the New World. Okay. I approached my first book, which was my doctoral dissertation, within a deeply rooted framework of Americanization. Okay. So I started with the educated assumption that warfare in America forced English settlers to unlearn the European way of war and adopt an American way of war. It's a term of art. Adopt a way of war that was better suited to the unique conditions of America. You know, uneven wooded environments and an Indian opponent that used open-ordered tactics. Okay. The evidence, however, as I worked on that dissertation, the evidence showed that the settlers were not Americanized, but militarily speaking, but instead remained committed to English military conventions or European military conventions. The research on my second book, which is about piracy and illegal trade, also revealed a cultural sameness between Britain and British America. And so Anglos in America and in the old country shared pre-modern beliefs that upheld the legality and propriety, legitimacy of commerce raiding and smuggling. And this is why on both sides of the Atlantic, English people resisted and thwarted the British government's efforts to delegitimize and stamp out these trades of piracy and smuggling. These early research projects, therefore, changed my perspective, and they shaped my classes on revolutionary America, and shaped my third book on the revolution. And this third book is a dissenting companion to the traditional US history textbook that I and most of my colleagues regularly assign in our American history classes on early America. And the problem, I mean, it's not a problem, but the feature of the traditional, of the US history textbook is that that they are a history guide to a class on US history, United States history. And these classes are designed, by definition, as national history. Okay, these classes are an effort to understand the formation of the American character, the American identity, American institutions. And because of that, virtually all US history textbooks from, you know, K through 12 and through college, they use the narrative of Americanization to help students understand how the United States developed its own identity, culture, and institutions. And this approach that you see manifested in textbooks uses hindsight to identify for students antecedents of the revolution in the colonial era. Okay, so it highlights Puritan separatism and the Mayflower Compact and economic and cultural dynamics of the frontier, imperial restrictions on American trade and manufacturing, the rise of colonial assemblies, the development of American racial attitudes and practices, the Great Awakening, the Albany Plan, Braddock's defeat on the military side, etc. Okay, so the result is that these textbooks tell a story of America's physical and social environment gradually transforming English settlers into Americans. And this gradual Americanization eventually differentiated and distanced these settlers from their mother country. The result being the revolution. What I aim to do in my classes on the revolution and in this last book is not to debunk this narrative that the students know, to tell them that they're wrong about Americanization and that the truth is Anglicization. Rather, my point is to illustrate to students that the authors of their history textbooks are not simply relaying a series of facts about the past. Okay? They're advancing a particular interpretation of the past, the Americanization Thesis. Okay? It's not just the facts account of what happened, but an argument, okay? An interpretation of the past, and that there's another interpretation too. Okay, so that the students, we Americans, we can't just accept what the textbook tells us or what the professor tells us. Okay? Students need to, since this is not just the facts, but rather an interpretation, and there's another interpretation as well, it forces students, all of us, to test these interpretations, okay? To accept or reject this or that interpretation on the strength of evidence rather than because a textbook told me or some professor told me. Okay? So what I'm trying to do for my students in class and for my readers is to explain why historians disagree. Okay? I try to illustrate to them that historians disagree not because some are wise and others are fools, or some are knowledgeable and others are ignorant, or some are truthful and others mendacious. That there are wise, knowledgeable, and sincere scholars on both sides of historical debates because there's genuine disagreement about how we should read the evidence and about which evidence is more significant. And I also try to illustrate that the Americanization debate is significant for anyone interested in American history. It determines whether the ideas that we associate with the American Revolution were created in America or transported to America. Whether America Americanized English settlers, or whether America was Anglicized by the settlers. Whether centrifugal forces drew the colonies away from Britain, or were the colonies increasingly integrated into a transatlantic British civilization. Okay? Whether the revolutionists rebelled because they were American or because they were English. Whether the American Revolution was simply one in a series of British revolutions or British rebellions. Whether the revolution aimed to create a new political system or preserve an old political system. And whether the revolutionary era is a story about change or a story about resistance to change. And more philosophically, the Americanization debate raises the question of whether people from the past are reliable witnesses to their own beliefs and motivations. Because American colonists are not the ones telling us that Americanization was taking place. Okay? American colonists saw themselves as English in every way. Okay? It's modern historians who are telling us that Americanization was taking place in the hearts and minds of English settlers. Okay? So if people in the past are reliable witnesses about themselves, then historians should investigate past societies through the eyes of contemporaries, channeling how they themselves understood their actions. But if people in the past are unreliable witnesses, then historians must use hindsight and comparative models and integrated data to identify forces such as Americanization that were hidden from contemporaries back then, that contemporaries were not aware of, but that nevertheless shaped their ideas and actions subconsciously. Now, both of these methods have defenders. Both of them make a great deal of sense. Okay, either doing history through the eyes of contemporaries, or we're doing history with the advantages that hindsight and integrated data, etc., offer us. Okay? But you can't do both at the same time. We either trust colonial Americans to explain their beliefs and actions to us, or we don't. Okay? And awareness of what is gained and lost in each historiographical method reveals to students that history is more contentious and a more active endeavor than simply chronicling historical facts. I'd like to end with one last observation about how history shapes our understanding of America. When we see heated public debates on Civil War monuments and gun rights and healthcare policies, church and state, education, criminal justice, a constitution that was written over 200 years ago, it's easy to understand the role that, when you see these heated debates or arguments live, you can see the role that historical interpretation plays in our private and public lives. Okay? When I immigrated to the United States, it was these debates that clarified to me that I did not understand American culture, American values, and Americans as well as I had previously believed. Okay? But I know that many native-born Americans are in the same boat. They're equally perplexed by their fellow Americans and by the political culture that surrounds them. Okay? There's no doubt that this is partly due to the fact that we don't know our fellow Americans very well. Okay? We've all insulated ourselves from other types of Americans by living and working and socializing only with those who share our sociological profile, and like educational attainment, family structure, excuse me, dogs. People who share our educational attainment, our kind of wealth levels, aesthetic taste, political sensibilities. So fine, that's our fault. But there's good reason to also lay some blame at the feet of those responsible for helping Americans understand their own history. Okay, and that's parents first, foremost, but also historians and history teachers. Okay? After all, American history is how we absorb our civics lessons about American society, institutions, and political culture. So we can all help ourselves make better sense of American society today by seeking out histories that challenge basic assumptions and beliefs we hold about the American past, like, for example, the Americanization narrative. At the very least, these dissenting histories can reveal to you that other people understand the present differently, not because they're ignorant or deranged, but because they understand the past differently. It might show you that their view of the past is not, fake news, but actually has some merit. Okay? And it might even lead you to consider the possibility that your own understanding of the past and of your fellow Americans might be incomplete or flawed or erroneous. You know, historians like to say that the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. And we use this quotation to remind audiences to approach past societies as anthropologists, okay? Studying them on their own terms rather than assessing how well or how poorly they conform to our own culture. So reading histories can help us recognize that practices and beliefs that we deem funny, bizarre, foolish, or cruel seemed utterly normal and sensible to reasonable, intelligent, decent, and honorable people at the time. You know, reading histories is like traveling abroad in this respect. You know, foreign travel can help us understand, tolerate, and respect foreign cultures and their funny, bizarre, foolish, or cruel practices and beliefs. So if reading American histories can teach us to understand and even respect previous generations of Americans, despite differences between us and them, then who knows, it might even help us extend the same respectfulness, cultural respectfulness, to Americans today in our own society who perplex us with practices and beliefs that we find bizarre, foolish, or cruel. Okay, it might help us understand and even respect them as well. Thank you.